Thursday, September 14th, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, United States. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto stood motionless beside the garbage incinerator, his hands trembling as he watched an American soldier toss a pair of leather boots into the flames. The boots were scuffed, certainly, the leather creased at the ankles, the toes showing wear, but the soles remained thick, the stitching intact, the laces whole. Back home in Osaka, his father would have repaired such boots 3 times over, replacing the soles with tire rubber, stuffing the interior with newspaper, wearing them until they literally fell apart. Here, they burned. The acrid smell of smoldering leather mixed with autumn air. Takeshi's own feet, wrapped in cloth bandages beneath crude sandals fashioned from rope and wood, throbbed with each heartbeat. He had worn these makeshift zori for 8 months since his boots disintegrated during the Bougainville campaign. The Imperial Japanese Army had issued him those boots in 1941, 1 pair to last the entire war. He had resoled them twice with cardboard, packed them with rice straw for insulation, and nursed them through jungle rot until the leather finally surrendered to mold, and his big toes protruded through holes no amount of stitching could close. Why? The word escaped his lips in Japanese before he could stop it. The American soldier, a freckled corporal named Miller, glanced over and shrugged. 3 months old, he said in English, gesturing at the burning boots. Got issued new ones yesterday. These were getting uncomfortable. 3 months. Takeshi had made his last pair last 3 years. Around him, 17 other Japanese prisoners stood in similar shock, their gaunt frames draped in the faded, patched uniforms they'd been captured in. Some still wore the same shirts they'd put on in 1942, fabric so thin it was translucent, holes crudely sewn with fishing line. Others had wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. All of them stared at the incinerator with the same expression of disbelief that Takeshi felt crushing his chest. "Motai nai," whispered Corporal Hideaki Sato beside him. What a waste! The word felt inadequate, almost profane in its insufficiency to capture the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The weight of lies. Takeshi Yamamoto, age 24, had believed every word. Born in Osaka's industrial district, he'd worked in his father's shoe repair shop before conscription in 1940. He'd listened to the radio broadcasts describing America as a nation of soft, materialistic weaklings who couldn't endure hardship, who would crumble when faced with Japanese fighting spirit, Yamato Damashi. The Americans, Tokyo assured them, were running out of resources. Their economy was collapsing. Their production capabilities were exhausted. Their soldiers went hungry while Japan's empire secured the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. On Bougainville, as Takeshi's unit starved on half rations of wormy rice and tree bark soup, their commanding officer had read dispatches claiming American forces were near collapse. Japanese naval victories had cut their supply lines. American soldiers were abandoning their positions. The war would end by Christmas 1943. Then January 1944 arrived. So did American artillery that didn't stop for 3 days straight. The shells kept coming, thousands of them, tens of thousands, until Takeshi understood with crystalline clarity that someone had been lying about American production capacity. He'd surrendered in March, along with 43 others from his company, the survivors of a unit that had numbered 218 men in 1942. Takeshi had weighed 51 kilograms when captured, down from 72 at enlistment. His ribs protruded like ladder rungs. His teeth had loosened from scurvy. His boots had finally died, and his feet bled through the improvised sandals he'd fashioned from palm fronds and parachute cord, salvaged from a downed American plane. The journey to the prison camp had taken 6 weeks, by ship to Hawaii, then by train across an American continent that stretched impossibly wide. Takeshi had pressed his face to the train window, watching farmland roll past for days, fields of wheat extending to the horizon, cattle by the thousands, towns with electric lights blazing wastefully through the night, automobiles, so many automobiles on roads that actually had pavement instead of mud. The propaganda minister's voice echoed in his memory. America suffers from critical shortages of food, fuel, and industrial materials. Their people starve while their corrupt government wages aggressive war. The farm said otherwise. The endless farm said something entirely different. Now, standing beside this incinerator, watching perfectly serviceable boots turn to ash, Takeshi felt the first hairline crack form in the foundation of everything he'd been taught. He tried to suppress it, to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps this was a special camp supplied with captured Japanese equipment to break prisoners' spirits. Perhaps these boots were defective, unsafe, and the Americans burned them for the prisoners' protection. But deep in his chest, beneath the propaganda slogans and the military discipline and 4 years of indoctrination, a small voice whispered, "What if everything was a lie?" The numbers that didn't add up, the scale of the deception began revealing itself in statistics that Takeshi would encounter in the camp's education center, where American officers conducted mandatory orientation sessions. The numbers arrived like body blows. Boot production, Japan, 1943, 2.1 million pairs for entire military. United States, 1943, 89 million pairs for military alone. Ratio, America produced 42 times more leather allocation per soldier. Imperial Japanese Army, 1 pair of boots intended to last entire service period, with resoling twice yearly if materials available. U.S. Army, minimum 2 pairs per soldier per year, automatic replacement when wear exceeded 30%. Supplemental allocation, separate boots for dress, combat, tropical, Arctic, and specialized units. Textile production for uniforms, Japan, 1943. 437 million meters of military fabric, United States, 1943. 4.1 billion meters of military fabric. This meant 1 American soldier received more textile than 10 Japanese soldiers. Footwear replacement criteria. Japanese military, replace when completely unwearable. Holes through sole, upper separated safety hazard. American military, replace when comfort degraded, fit loosened, tread depth below 3 meters, or any visible wear that might reduce performance. For soldiers like Takeshi, who had spent months walking on cardboard insoles cut from supply crates, who had stuffed their disintegrating boots with newspaper and tree bark, who had watched comrades march until their feet bled through fabric wrappings. These numbers represented something beyond mere statistics. They represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy they'd been fighting. Japan's entire boot production for all military branches couldn't supply half of America's Army, Navy, and Marine forces. The empire that claimed to be outproducing the decadent West was being outproduced by a factor of 40. Takeshi had trouble breathing when he first saw these figures. Corporal Sato, the former schoolteacher from Kyoto who bunked beside him, did the arithmetic 3 times, certain there must be an error, a misplaced decimal point. There wasn't. "The whole time," Sato said quietly, staring at the paper, "the whole time we were losing." First contact. The Quartermaster's Warehouse. Friday, September 15th, 1944. The morning after the boot burning, Takeshi's work detail was assigned to the camp quartermaster's supply warehouse. 18 Japanese prisoners shuffled through the entrance, flanked by 2 guards who seemed more bored than vigilant. The doors opened. Time seemed to decelerate. Takeshi's brain struggled to process what his eyes reported. The warehouse stretched 200 feet deep, maybe more. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, supplies. Not the meager, carefully rationed supplies of the Imperial Army. Not the empty shelves and apologetic requisition officers he'd grown accustomed to in the Pacific. This was abundance that defied his vocabulary, abundance so total it became obscene. Boots. Thousands of pairs of boots, stacked in boxes labeled by size, organized by type. Combat boots, dress boots, tropical boots, insulated boots. The leather smell was overwhelming, rich, and oily. Takeshi's nose, accustomed to the rot-sweet stench of jungle mold and deteriorating canvas, recoiled from the intensity of it. Fresh leather, new leather, leather that had never touched feet, never known mud, never been salvaged and repaired and resoled until it barely resembled footwear anymore. He stopped walking. His legs simply refused the command to continue. Behind him, another prisoner gasped audibly. Someone else made a small, wounded sound, almost a whimper. "Keep moving," the American guard said, not unkindly. "This is just the boot section. Got 4 more warehouses this size." 4 more. The words didn't make sense. Takeshi's hand reached out involuntarily, fingers brushing a box of combat boots, size 9. The cardboard was clean, unwrinkled, stamped with manufacturer information. Goodyear Rubber Company, 1944, U.S. Army Specification, MIL S43511. Inside, through the open top, he glimpsed pristine boots wrapped in paper, their surfaces unmarred by wear, their laces stiff and new. On Bougainville, Takeshi's squad had shared 2 sewing needles among 40 men. The needles had been salvaged from a medical kit, carefully guarded by their sergeant, rationed out for 15 minutes at a time to repair clothing and equipment. When one needle broke in February 1943, they'd held a moment of silence, then carefully saved both halves to use as awls. Here, boxes of sewing kits sat stacked carelessly, hundreds of them, each kit containing multiple needles, thread in 6 colors, scissors, buttons, patches. The boxes weren't even locked. They sat there, available, abundant, waiting to be requisitioned. Takeshi's throat constricted. He tried to swallow and couldn't. "Touch it," said Private First Class Tanaka from behind him, voice hoarse. "I need to know if it's real." Takeshi picked up a sewing kit. The cardboard was firm, clean, recently manufactured. He opened it. Scissors gleamed, edges sharp. 5 needles lay in formation, still in their paper wrapping. 3 spools of black thread, 2 of olive drab, 1 of white. A packet of assorted buttons. A thimble. A seam ripper, a tool Takeshi had never seen before, designed specifically for the single purpose of removing stitches. They made tools for removing stitches. In Japan, stitches were precious, carefully placed, never removed. Here, they had specialized implements for undoing them. "This is—" Tanaka couldn't finish the sentence. "Propaganda," Sato whispered urgently. "It has to be. They've filled this warehouse to deceive us. It's psychological warfare." But the dust patterns told a different story. Takeshi, who had worked inventory in his father's shop, recognized the signs of regular use. The boxes at the front of each shelf showed handling wear, edges softened, corners dented. Behind them, fresh boxes stood in reserve. This wasn't a Hollywood set constructed to impress prisoners. This was a working warehouse, regularly depleted and restocked, part of a supply system that operated with such efficiency it could afford to be casual. An American sergeant walked past, clipboard in hand, checking inventory. He pulled a box of boots from a shelf, opened it, examined the contents with a practiced eye. "These are from the March batch," he said to his assistant, starting to show storage degradation. "Mark them for issue to the work details. The prisoners can use them." Storage degradation. Boots degraded in storage before anyone wore them, and rather than repair them, Americans simply issued them to prisoners. Not as punishment, but as pragmatism. Good enough for captive Japanese soldiers, but not quite good enough for American troops. Takeshi's hands began to shake. He set the sewing kit down carefully, afraid he might drop it, afraid his trembling fingers might damage something that represented more wealth than his entire squad had possessed in 2 years of jungle warfare. "Keep moving," the guard repeated. They walked deeper into the warehouse. The accumulation continued. Clothing, blankets, mess kits, canteens, first aid supplies, entrenching tools, flashlights, batteries, writing paper, soap. Soap in quantities that defied reason. Bars of white soap stacked in cases, not the harsh lye soap Japanese soldiers scrubbed with when any soap was available, but proper toilet soap, individually wrapped, scented with something Takeshi's nose couldn't identify, but his brain labeled as clean. At the warehouse's rear, they reached the discard pile. Equipment deemed unfit for issue sat here awaiting disposal or recycling. Takeshi saw boots with worn heels, shirts with faded dye, trousers with loose seams, canteens with small dents. All of it would have been treasured in the Imperial Army. All of it was garbage here. "The trash," someone said in Japanese, voice flat with shock. "This is their trash." Private Kojima, the former farmer from Hokkaido, picked up a discarded shirt. He held it to the light, examining it with the scrutiny of a man who had sewn patches on patches, who had worn clothing until it literally fell apart. "The buttons are intact," he said. "The fabric is... it's just faded. The elbows are thin, but not through. With 2 hours' work, this would be better than my best shirt." He looked at the pile, hundreds of garments, maybe thousands, and his face crumpled. He didn't cry, not quite, but his jaw worked and his eyes went bright. "We've been fighting America," he said. "We've been fighting this." The walk back to the barracks passed in silence. Each man processed what he'd seen in his own way. Some faces showed anger, the bitter rage of betrayal, of learning you'd been lied to by leaders you'd trusted with your life. Others showed something closer to grief, mourning for the comrades who died believing in those lies. A few looked simply empty, hollowed out by the collision between propaganda and reality. That night, Takeshi lay on his bunk, a real bunk with a mattress in a heated barracks, staring at the ceiling. His feet, for the first time in months, didn't hurt. The Americans had issued him boots that afternoon. Real boots, new boots. They fit properly. The leather was soft, broken in, but not broken down, issued from that discard pile because they'd been deemed storage degraded after sitting unused for 6 months. 6 months. These boots were younger than most of his clothing. He tried to sleep and couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that warehouse, those boxes, that casual, impossible abundance. And he thought about his squad on Bougainville, men who had died fighting for an empire that couldn't even supply them with boots, men who had charged American positions because officers told them American weakness meant certain Japanese victory, men who had believed, as Takeshi had believed, that suffering proved superiority and deprivation built strength. "Uso data," he whispered to the darkness. It was all lies. Beside him, Corporal Sato's voice came quiet and certain. Yes. The accumulation. September 22, 1944. 1 week into captivity, the evidence continued mounting like testimony in a trial against everything Takeshi had been taught. The mess hall presented the first morning's revelation. Breakfast. Actual breakfast, not the watery rice gruel that had constituted morning meals in the Pacific, arrived on metal trays. Scrambled eggs, toast with butter, bacon, orange juice, coffee, and an apple. Takeshi stared at his tray, at the abundance of protein and fat and fresh fruit, and felt his stomach rebel. It was too much. His body, accustomed to starvation rations, didn't recognize this as food. It looked like propaganda, like something from one of those American magazines Japanese soldiers found on captured Marines, the ones showing impossible kitchens and smiling families eating impossible meals. Poison, someone suggested, but the American guards ate the same food, from the same kitchen prepared by the same cooks. Japanese prisoners were permitted to work in the kitchen. They could watch the entire preparation process. No poison. Just food. An abundance of food that exceeded the officers' mess in Tokyo. Private Ichiro Nakamura, captured on Saipan, had recorded in a hidden diary, "Today I ate more than my family in Japan receives in a week. I am a prisoner. They are free citizens of the empire." Why do I eat better in captivity than they do at home? The rations told a story in pure numbers. Daily caloric intake. Imperial Japanese Army, Pacific Theater, 1943-44. 1/500 reason 1/800 calories when supply lines held. Imperial Japanese Army, Pacific Theater actual. 800 1,200 calories after Allied interdiction. Japanese civilian population, 1944. 1,400 1,600 calories rationed. American POW rations, Geneva Convention minimum, 2,000 calories. Actual American POW rations, Camp McCoy, 2,800 3,200 calories. Active U.S. Army soldier rations, 4,000 4,500 calories. Takeshi had been receiving more food as a prisoner than he'd eaten as an active combat soldier. His captors fed him better than his own government had. September 28, 1944. The medical examination revealed further evidence of the gap between propaganda and reality. A U.S. Army doctor, Captain Morrison, examined each prisoner thoroughly. Weight, height, dental inspection, examination for malnutrition diseases, treatment of wounds and infections. Takeshi stood on the scale, 51 kilograms at capture. Now, 2 weeks later, 54 kilograms. 3 kilograms gained in 14 days of captivity. He had lost 21 kilograms during 2 years of military service. Captain Morrison examined Takeshi's feet, where months of inadequate footwear had left the kind of damage that didn't heal quickly. Infections between the toes, calluses thick as leather, deformed toenails. The doctor shook his head, made notes, prescribed ointments and bandages, recommended Takeshi avoid heavy labor for 2 weeks until the infections cleared. 2 weeks, the captain said through a translator. Keep them clean, dry, and bandaged. Change the dressing daily. I'll check progress in 5 days. The medical supplies arrived that afternoon. antibiotic ointment, cotton bandages, surgical tape, foot powder. More medical supplies for one prisoner's foot infection than Takeshi's entire company had possessed at full strength. On Bougainville, they'd shared one bottle of iodine among 200 men. They'd torn strips from clothing to make bandages. They'd reused bandages after boiling them, reused them until the fabric disintegrated, then went without. Here, the bandages were disposable, use once, throw away, new bandages tomorrow. October 3, 1944. The trash detail proved particularly educational. Takeshi and 5 others were assigned to collect and sort the camp's refuse. In Japan, waste was nearly non-existent. Everything was used, reused, repaired, and repurposed until absolutely nothing remained. Here, the garbage was a window into American material reality. From one day's collection, 17 pairs of socks discarded because of holes in the heels, 8 shirts thrown away for stains or minor tears, 43 partially used bars of soap. Americans apparently discarded soap when it became too small to hold comfortably. Uncounted pounds of food waste, bread crusts, fruit peels, vegetable trimmings, meat scraps. Lance Corporal Fujita, who had been collecting scrap metal for the war effort in Japan before conscription, conducted a quiet inventory. In 1 week, the camp's 600 American personnel and 300 prisoners generated enough discarded metal to equal what his entire prefecture had been ordered to collect in a month. "We were collecting nails from our own homes," Fujita said, voice hollow. "We pulled nails from our walls to donate to the war effort. We were proud. We were helping the empire." He held up a mess kit someone had thrown away because of a small dent. "They throw this away. We pulled apart our homes." October 10, 1944. The work details exposed prisoners to American military operations, and with each exposure, the propaganda crumbled further. Takeshi's group was assigned to the motor pool, washing and maintaining vehicles. The motor pool contained 67 trucks, 18 jeeps, 12 ambulances, and various support vehicles. For one camp, not a combat unit, a prisoner of war facility in Wisconsin. The vehicles received regular maintenance, oil changes every 3 months, tire rotations, engine tune-ups. Mechanics replaced parts at the first sign of wear rather than waiting for failure. In the Pacific, Takeshi's regiment had possessed 3 trucks for 2,000 men. The trucks ran until they died, then were cannibalized for parts to keep the other trucks running, until finally all 3 sat immobile, their corpses stripped bare. Here, a truck's oil was changed because it was due for service, not because it had failed. Preventive maintenance, the luxury of replacing things before they broke. Sergeant Ito, a former mechanic from Yokohama, worked alongside American mechanics and learned their standards. He later wrote, "I watched them discard a spark plug because it showed excessive wear, meaning it had been used. In Japan, we cleaned and reused spark plugs until they literally cracked apart. Here, they used them once and threw them away." The American mechanic said using worn spark plugs reduced engine efficiency by 35%. A 3% reduction was unacceptable. We would have celebrated 50% efficiency. October 17, 1944. The camp tailor shop revealed another dimension of the divide. American soldiers could have alterations done to their uniforms for better fit, for comfort, for appearance. They could request repairs to damaged uniforms, tiers mended, buttons replaced, seams reinforced. But most didn't bother. It was easier to simply requisition new uniforms than to repair old ones. Takeshi, assigned to the tailor shop because of his experience in his father's business, found himself repairing clothing that wasn't actually damaged. A loose button here, a slightly frayed cuff there, alterations that in Japan would have been handled immediately because clothing was precious. Here, soldiers often just ordered replacements instead. "Why fix a shirt when you can get a new one?" an American private asked, genuinely puzzled when Takeshi carefully mended a tear in the sleeve. "Takes you an hour to fix that. I can get a new shirt in 5 minutes." The abundance of choice. That was the real revelation. These weren't desperate men making do with inadequate supplies. These were men who had so much that repair seemed inefficient compared to replacement. Takeshi found himself working on a jacket that a soldier wanted altered, taken in at the waist, shortened slightly in the sleeves, because the fit wasn't quite right, not because it was damaged, not because it was unusable, because the fit wasn't perfect. On Bougainville, Takeshi had worn a jacket 3 sizes too large, the previous owner's name still stenciled inside, the previous owner having died of malaria in January 1943. The jacket had holes from shrapnel, patches on patches, sleeves frayed to threads. Takeshi had worn it every day for 9 months, grateful to have it. He'd never once considered that it wasn't quite right. October 24, 1944. The revelation that broke something fundamental in Takeshi came from an unexpected source: laundry. The camp had washing machines, actual machines that washed clothing using hot water, soap, and agitation. Takeshi had heard of such devices. American propaganda films showed them, but seeing them was different. Watching an American soldier casually dump his clothes into a machine, add soap, press a button, and walk away while the machine did the work was different. In Japan, Takeshi's mother had washed clothing by hand, scrubbing each item in cold water with harsh soap, hanging everything to dry, ironing with a heated press. She'd done this for 4 people, every week, for years. Here, machines did it. Hot water flowed freely, not rationed, not conserved, just available. Soap came in large boxes. Dryers tumbled clothing until it came out warm and soft. The Americans complained if the machines were occupied, impatient at having to wait 30 minutes for their turn. 30 minutes. In Japan, laundry was an all-day affair. But what shattered Takeshi's composure was watching an American soldier pull his clothing from the dryer, wrinkle his nose, and throw a shirt back into the wash because it doesn't smell quite fresh enough. Not dirty, not stained, not unwearable, just not fresh-smelling enough. Takeshi's shirt, his actual shirt, the one he'd been captured in, had been worn continuously for 4 months before capture. It smelled of sweat, mold, jungle rot, and death. He'd washed it 3 times in those 4 months, using river water and no soap, hanging it on branches to dry while he sat shirtless in the rain. Fresh smelling had been a fantasy, a memory from civilian life, something that belonged to a world that no longer existed. This American soldier rejected a clean shirt because the scent wasn't perfect. Takeshi walked outside. His hands were shaking again and his chest felt tight. He sat on a bench behind the laundry facility, staring at nothing, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Corporal Sato found him there 20 minutes later. Sato sat beside him in silence for a while, then said, "The boots were just the beginning. Yes, everything they told us was lies. Yes, the Americans aren't weak. They aren't running out of supplies. They aren't close to collapse. No. We never had a chance, did we?" Takeshi thought about the factories of Osaka, where he'd worked before the war. Small factories producing items one at a time, craftsmen working metal with hand tools, production measured in dozens per day. He thought about the propaganda films showing Japanese industrial might, the carefully framed shots of assembly lines that he now realized were tiny compared to what America must possess to generate this kind of abundance. "No," he said, "we never did." October 31st, 1944. Halloween. The Americans celebrated with a party. Music, dancing, costumes made from available materials. They invited the Japanese prisoners to attend, to observe, to participate, if they wished. Takeshi watched American soldiers laugh, dance, eat candy that had been specially shipped from the United States for this celebration. Candy. For a party. For fun. On Bougainville, men had died fighting over the last tin of preserved fish. They'd killed each other, Japanese killing Japanese, when rations ran so low that survival meant someone else's death. Takeshi had watched it happen. He'd nearly participated. These soldiers had candy shipped across an ocean for a party. The contrast wasn't just material, it was philosophical. It revealed 2 completely different approaches to war, to life, to the value of human comfort and joy. Japan's military philosophy demanded suffering, treated hardship as purifying, insisted that deprivation built character and strength. Soldiers were expected to endure, to make do, to sacrifice everything, including basic human needs. America's philosophy seemed to be, our soldiers deserve the best we can provide. They should be comfortable, well-fed, well-equipped, and, when possible, happy. One approach turned men into instruments of national will, their humanity subordinated to empire. The other treated soldiers as humans who deserved dignity even while fighting. Takeshi didn't participate in the Halloween celebration. He sat at the edge of the room, watching, trying to reconcile these laughing, candy-eating soldiers with the demonic American enemies described by Japanese propaganda. These were the barbarians who supposedly ate human flesh, who killed prisoners for sport, who represented the corruption of Western civilization. These were men eating candy and dancing to music that sounded strange to Takeshi's ears but wasn't evil, wasn't demonic, was just different. November 7th, 1944. The mail arrived. American soldiers received letters from home, packages containing cookies, photographs, small luxuries sent by families who had the resources to ship parcels across continents. Some soldiers received newspapers from home, actual newspapers, multiple pages, printed on decent paper, filled with news, advertisements, comic strips. Takeshi glimpsed one newspaper's advertisements: washing machines for sale, automobiles, refrigerators, furniture, clothing, products available for purchase. Despite the war, despite rationing, despite the demands of military production, in Japan there were no advertisements because there was nothing to buy. Store shelves sat empty. Production went to the military. Civilians made do, wore the same clothing for years, repaired everything until it was unrepairable, then repaired it some more. Here, Americans could still buy washing machines. One soldier showed Takeshi a photograph from home, his family in front of their house, his wife and children smiling, everyone well-fed, well-dressed, the house intact and comfortable. "Can't wait to get back to this," the soldier said. Homesick, but not desperate, confident he'd survive, confident he'd return to a life that was still there, still comfortable, still whole. Takeshi thought about his family in Osaka. He didn't know if they were alive. The city had been bombed repeatedly. Food was scarce, clothing was scarce, everything was scarce. If they'd survived, they were enduring hardships he could barely imagine now that he was experiencing American abundance. He was eating better as a prisoner than his family was eating as free citizens. That night, Takeshi tried to write a letter home. The Americans permitted prisoners to send mail, though it would be censored and delayed. He sat with pen and paper, good paper, decent ink, provided free, and couldn't write. What could he say? "I am comfortable here. I am eating well. I am being treated humanely by the enemy we were told were demons. Everything the government told us was a lie. The war is already lost. We're just too stubborn to admit it." He couldn't write that. The censors would never permit it. His family would never receive it. And if they did receive it, it would only cause pain, knowing that he was comfortable while they suffered. So he wrote the expected things. "I am alive. I am being treated acceptably. I hope you are well. I think of you always." Safe words that communicated nothing true. The letter sat on his bunk, unsent for 3 days before he finally submitted it. Even those empty words felt like betrayal. The breaking point, November 15th, 1944. Morning formation routine. The prisoners assembled in the yard for roll call and work assignments. A truck pulled up. Nothing unusual, trucks came and went constantly, and soldiers began unloading boxes. Boots, new boots, winter boots specifically, rated for cold weather, heavy leather, insulated, designed for Wisconsin's brutal winters. The quartermaster announced that all prisoners would be issued winter boots, effective immediately. The boots they'd been issued 6 weeks ago weren't adequate for coming winter conditions. 6 weeks. They were replacing boots that were 6 weeks old because Wisconsin winters required better insulation. Takeshi looked down at his boots. The storage-degraded boots he'd been issued from the discard pile, the boots that were better than anything he'd owned in the Imperial Army, the boots that had changed his life simply by fitting properly and not having holes. They were being replaced because winter was coming, because better boots were required. Something inside him snapped, not violently, not dramatically, more like a cable that's been under tension too long, finally fraying apart. The individual strands separating until the whole thing gives way with a soft, almost gentle release. He thought about his father's shop in Osaka, where they'd repaired boots until there was more patch than original leather, where customers would carefully budget for new soles, where a good pair of boots represented a month's wages and was expected to last 5 years minimum. He thought about the soldiers on Bougainville, walking through jungle muck in homemade sandals, their feet rotting from fungal infections, unable to march, unable to fight, dying because the empire couldn't provide them with something as basic as boots. He thought about the propaganda speeches in training, the officers explaining that American material superiority was irrelevant because Japanese fighting spirit would prevail, that spiritual strength transcended physical resources, that suffering purified, that deprivation built character. He thought about watching his comrades starve, watching them die of diseases that antibiotics could have cured, watching them fight with inadequate weapons, inadequate supplies, inadequate everything, while being told their inadequacy was actually moral superiority. The evidence had accumulated beyond his ability to deny it. America produced 42 times more boots. America fed prisoners better than Japan fed soldiers. America replaced equipment while Japan couldn't supply it in the first place. America had washing machines, hot water, waste disposal, casual abundance in every direction. America fought with overwhelming material superiority while treating that superiority as baseline expectation, not luxury. The propaganda had been comprehensive lies, not mistakes, not errors, not unfortunate misunderstandings, deliberate lies. Someone in Tokyo had known the truth and chose to lie, chose to send millions of men to fight a war they couldn't win, chose to waste lives rather than admit defeat, chose to let soldiers die in ignorance of how hopeless their situation truly was. Takeshi stood in formation, holding his new winter boots, and felt his entire worldview disassemble. Every belief, every sacrifice, every moment of suffering and endurance, all of it built on lies. The empire was broken. The war was lost. The master race narrative was fiction. The spiritual superiority was fantasy compensating for material inferiority. They'd never had a chance. Not from the beginning. Not from December 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The moment they'd chosen America as an enemy, they'd chosen defeat. The only variable was how long it would take and how many would die learning that truth. Private Yamamoto, the American sergeant, was looking at him with concern. "You all right? You're crying." Takeshi touched his face. His cheeks were wet. He hadn't noticed. The tears had come silently, without his permission, without his awareness. "I'm fine," he said in halting English. "Thank you." He wasn't fine. He would never be fine again. You can't unlearn truth. You can't unknow what you've seen. The man who had believed in the empire's righteousness had died somewhere between the boot incinerator and this moment. What remained was someone who had to figure out how to live with the knowledge that he'd been lied to, that his comrades had died for lies, that his suffering had been unnecessary, and his sacrifices wasted. That night, the Japanese prisoners held an informal gathering in their barracks. No one organized it officially. They simply gravitated together after dinner, 23 men sitting on bunks and floors, speaking in low voices. "We need to discuss what we're seeing," Corporal Sato said. He'd become the unofficial spokesman, the former teacher's authority translating into prison dynamics. "We can't keep pretending this is normal. We can't keep explaining it away. It's propaganda," Private Tanaka insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're showing us abundance to break our spirit." "For 2 months?" Sergeant Ito shook his head. "You don't maintain an elaborate deception for 2 months for 300 prisoners. This is their reality. This is how they actually live." "The boots," Takeshi heard himself saying. Everyone turned to look at him. He rarely spoke at these gatherings, preferring to observe. But the words came out anyway. "I keep thinking about the boots, not the new ones, the ones they threw away, 3 months old, uncomfortable. So they burned them." "What about it?" someone asked. "My father is a cobbler, was a cobbler." Takeshi didn't know if his father was still alive, if the shop still existed, if Osaka still stood. He could have repaired those boots. New insoles stretched the leather, made them comfortable again. 2 hours' work, maybe 3. In Japan, those boots would have been treasured. Here, they were garbage. "So?" Tanaka pressed. "That just proves Americans are wasteful." "No." Takeshi shook his head slowly. "It proves they have so much that waste is cheaper than repair. Think about what that means. Think about the industrial capacity required to make waste economical. They produce so much that the labor cost of repair exceeds the replacement cost. That's not weakness. That's the opposite of weakness." Silence settled over the room. The logic was inescapable. "We were taught they were running out of resources," Private Nakamura said quietly, "that their production was collapsing. that blockades were starving them. "They fed us 3 meals today," Ito responded. "Real meals. Meat, vegetables, bread, dairy. I calculated the calories, over 3,000. I never ate that well as a free man in Japan. I gained 8 kilograms," someone else added, "in 8 weeks. As a prisoner. The medical supplies, the machines, the trucks, the waste." The examples tumbled out, men who'd been processing their observations in isolation suddenly sharing them, the collective evidence mounting into an inescapable conclusion. "We lost the war," Corporal Sato said flatly. "Not yesterday, not last month. We lost it in 1941. We just didn't know it yet." "We're still fighting," Tanaka protested. Japan is finished." Ito's voice carried the weight of certainty. "I've worked with American mechanics. I've seen their maintenance schedules, their supply systems, their logistics. Do you know what they consider unacceptable? A 5% failure rate. 5%. In Japan, we celebrated 50% operational capacity. They have backup systems for their backup systems. We had nothing. So what do we do?" The question came from Private Kojima, the farmer who'd wept over discarded shirts. "We're prisoners. We can't change anything. We survive," Sato said. "We learn. We watch. And when we return to Japan, if we return to Japan, we remember what we saw here." "Remember what?" Nakamura asked. "That America is stronger. That we lost. What good does that do?" "Remember that the world is bigger than what we were told," Takeshi said. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been forming thoughts he hadn't consciously articulated. Remember that there are different ways to live, different ways to organize society, different ways to value human life. Remember that abundance is possible. Remember that soldiers don't have to suffer to be effective. Maybe they're more effective when they're well supplied and well fed. Remember that material resources matter, that production capacity wins wars, that spiritual strength without industrial strength is just philosophy. He paused, looking around at faces that mirrored his own conflicted emotions: pain, anger, grief, and beneath it all, a growing understanding. "Remember," he continued, "so that Japan never makes this mistake again." The Long Road Home. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news spread through Camp McCoy like wildfire. Japanese prisoners gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts describing the collapse of the Third Reich, the occupation of Berlin, the end of Hitler's regime. For Takeshi, it was confirmation of what he'd already accepted. The Axis powers were finished. Japan would be next. The only question was how long the dying would continue. He'd spent 9 months in captivity, 9 months of 3 meals daily, 9 months of medical care, adequate clothing, heated barracks, 9 months of watching American abundance made casual. He'd gained 23 kilograms. His feet had healed. His teeth had been repaired. An American dentist had filled 3 cavities and extracted 1 molar, all without charge, because prisoners were entitled to medical care. His body had recovered. His mind had transformed. The boy who'd believed in the empire's righteousness was gone. What remained was a man who understood the gulf between propaganda and reality, who had seen both sides of the war's material equation, who knew that Japan's defeat was mathematical inevitability. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice crackled over the radio, the first time most Japanese had ever heard him speak. The broadcast was in formal court Japanese, almost incomprehensible, but the meaning was clear. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Takeshi sat in the barracks with the others listening. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. A few looked relieved. Finally, the dying would stop. Tanaka, who'd resisted every revelation, who'd insisted until yesterday that Japan would never surrender, that victory was still possible, put his head in his hands and sobbed. Takeshi felt oddly calm. He'd accepted this outcome months ago. The only surprise was that it had taken so long, that so many more had to die before leaders in Tokyo accepted what Takeshi had learned by watching Americans throw away boots. October 1945, March 1946. The repatriation process began slowly, complicated by destroyed infrastructure and the logistics of moving millions of displaced persons. Japanese prisoners in American camps waited their turn, knowing they were returning to a devastated homeland. During these months, Takeshi worked in the camp's education program, learning English, studying American history, reading newspapers that described Japan's destruction. The firebombing of Tokyo had killed over 100,000 in a single night. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been erased by weapons Takeshi couldn't comprehend. Nearly every major Japanese city was partially or completely destroyed. The photographs showed ruins. Photographs showed his country reduced to rubble, his people reduced to scavengers picking through wreckage, children with swollen bellies from malnutrition, civilians who looked worse than Takeshi had looked at capture. He'd survived the war in better condition than most Japanese civilians. His captivity had been more comfortable than their freedom. April 12, 1946. The ship departed San Francisco, carrying 3,000 Japanese prisoners back to Japan. Takeshi stood at the rail, watching America recede. He tried to sort his feelings. Was he glad to leave, eager to return home, angry at his captors, grateful for his treatment? All of it. None of it. His emotions were too complex for simple categorization. He was returning to Japan, but he wasn't the same man who had left. That man had believed in the empire, in Japan's destiny, in spiritual superiority over material wealth. That man was dead. The person returning had seen what industrial power looked like, had experienced what abundance felt like, had learned that there were other ways to live, other values to hold, other truths beyond what Tokyo had taught. April 29th, 1946. Yokohama Harbor. The ship docked in a port city that barely existed anymore. Buildings reduced to skeletons, cranes standing idle. The smell of ash and decay still hanging in the air despite months of rain. Japanese officials processed the returning prisoners, asking questions, taking information, checking names against lists. The officials looked thin, exhausted, their uniforms patched and threadbare. Takeshi, in his American-issued clothing, looked healthier than they did. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "You'll need to turn in the American clothing," an official said. "Return in proper Japanese attire." Takeshi looked at his boots. Winter boots, American-made, barely worn despite 6 months of use. He thought about the journey ahead, walking through a destroyed country with inadequate transportation. He thought about the difference between these boots and the rope sandals he'd worn on Bougainville. "I need these," he said, "to get home." The official started to protest, then looked at Takeshi's feet, looked at the boots, looked at his own worn-through shoes held together with wire and string. He nodded. "Keep them." May 1946. The journey to Osaka took 3 weeks. Trains ran irregularly, their schedules dictated by track repairs and fuel shortages. Takeshi walked much of the way, joined by other former prisoners heading west. They walked through a Japan that had been bombed into another century, past cities that were now vacant lots, past fields where women and children worked because the men were dead or missing. Every person Takeshi saw looked hungry, not starving. The occupation forces were providing food aid, but chronically undernourished, thin, exhausted. He passed families living in shacks made from salvaged metal. He saw children wearing clothes sewn from military uniforms, from parachute silk, from whatever fabric could be found. The America he'd left behind. The America with washing machines and disposable soap and boots that were replaced because they weren't quite comfortable, existed on a different planet from this Japan of ruins and scarcity. His boots held up. American-made, designed for durability, they carried him across hundreds of kilometers without failure. He walked past Japanese soldiers in rope sandals, past civilians whose shoes were falling apart, and his American boots kept working. Even this was evidence of the gap. Late May 1946. Osaka. His neighborhood was rubble. The firebombing in March 1945 had destroyed most of the district. He walked through streets he'd known since childhood, now reduced to foundations and scattered debris. His father's shop was gone. The building was gone. Everything was gone. He found his family living in a temporary shelter. His father, his mother, his younger sister. They'd survived, though his mother had been burned in the firebombing, and his sister had lost her hearing to blast concussion. His father looked ancient, 20 years older than when Takeshi had last seen him in 1941. The reunion was emotional, tearful, complicated. His family couldn't understand why he looked so healthy, so well-fed, so strong. He was a returned prisoner who looked better than they did. "They treated you well?" his father asked, suspicious, disbelieving. "Yes," Takeshi said. "Very well." But they were the enemy. Yes. His father examined Takeshi's boots, the American boots, still intact, still functional. The cobbler's eye assessed them professionally. Quality leather, solid construction, good design. These are better than anything I ever made, his father admitted quietly. Better than anything I ever saw. I know. They gave these to you, to a prisoner. They issued them because winter was coming. They'd already issued me boots in September. These were the winter replacements. His father was silent for a long moment, his hand still holding Takeshi's boot, his craftsman's understanding, processing what this implied about American industrial capacity. We had no chance, his father said finally. Did we? No, we never did. Nru's testimony. 1962. 17 years after the war's end, a Japanese historian named Saburo Ienaga interviewed former POWs for a study on the psychological impact of captivity. He found Takeshi in Osaka, now running a shoe import business, married with 3 children, prosperous in the new Japan that had risen from the ashes. Yanaga's questions focused on the moment of transformation, the point where propaganda beliefs collapsed under the weight of observed reality. I remember the exact moment, Takeshi told him. September 14, 1944, day 1 in the camp. I watched an American soldier throw away a pair of boots because they were 3 months old and uncomfortable. He described the scene, the incinerator, the boots, his own rope sandals, the cognitive dissonance that threatened to break his mind. I tried to deny it, he continued, tried to explain it away as propaganda, as deception, as something other than what it obviously was. But the evidence kept accumulating. Every day, something new. Food, medical supplies, machines, waste, so much waste. Not because Americans were decadent or foolish, but because they had so much that waste was economically rational. When did you accept it? Yanaga asked. When did you stop resisting the evidence? November 15th. They issued us new boots, winter boots, replacing the boots they'd issued 6 weeks earlier. That's when I finally understood that everything we'd been told was lies. Not exaggerations, not mistakes, lies, deliberate lies designed to keep us fighting a war we'd already lost. Takeshi showed Yanaga his current inventory, shoes imported from America, from Italy, from England, quality footwear for Japan's growing middle class. I learned something in that camp. I learned that material abundance isn't weakness, it's strength. I learned that societies that can afford to be wasteful are stronger than societies that can't afford waste. I learned that industrial capacity matters, that production wins wars, that spiritual slogans don't stop artillery shells. Do you resent America? Yanaga asked. Takeshi considered the question carefully. I resent that we fought at all. I resent the leaders who sent us to die for a lie. But America? No. They treated me better as an enemy than my own government treated me as a soldier. They fed me, clothed me, kept me healthy. They showed me a different way of organizing society, a different set of values. They taught me, inadvertently, just by being themselves, that Japan's path was wrong. He paused, looking at his office, his inventory, his successful business built on importing the products of former enemies. Those boots saved my life, he said. Not just physically, though they did that too, kept my feet healthy during the journey home, but philosophically, they showed me truth. They were the crack in the wall of propaganda, and through that crack, I could see reality. Everything else followed from that moment. 1987. Takeshi Yamamoto, age 67, spoke to a group of high school students about his war experience. Japan had been at peace for 42 years. The students knew World War II only from textbooks, from their grandparents' stories, from a historical period that seemed impossibly distant. I want you to understand something, he told them. War is not glorious. It's not noble. It's not a test of spiritual strength. War is industrial production competing against industrial production. It's logistics. It's calories and bullets and boots. The side with more resources usually wins. The side that treats its soldiers as valuable human beings usually wins. The side that can afford to replace equipment before it fails usually wins. He showed them his original American boots, the ones from 1944, somehow preserved for 43 years, kept as a reminder. The leather was cracked now, the soles worn through, but they remained intact enough to demonstrate their quality. "These boots," he said, "taught me more about the real nature of war than 4 years of military service. They taught me that Japan lost not because we lacked fighting spirit, but because we lacked factories. We lost because we couldn't produce enough boots, enough bullets, enough food, enough fuel. We lost because our leaders chose war with an enemy that could casually throw away resources we would have died to possess." A student raised her hand. "Did you hate them, the Americans?" "At first I tried to. I was trained to hate them. But hatred requires believing your enemy is wrong, evil, inferior. I couldn't maintain that belief while watching them casually waste more than we had. I couldn't hate people who treated me better as a prisoner than my own officers treated me as a soldier. Hatred turned to understanding, and understanding turned to respect." "Do you think the war was avoidable?" another student asked. "With better leadership, yes. With leaders who understood the mathematical realities, who could calculate production capacities and resource availability, who valued Japanese lives more than Japanese pride, yes, absolutely. But we had leaders who believed spirit could overcome matter, who thought willpower could substitute for industrial capacity, who confused suffering with virtue." He held up the boots one more time. "These boots were garbage to them. They were treasure to me. That gap, that difference in perspective, in resource availability, in material conditions, was the entire war in microcosm. We were fighting an enemy who could afford to throw away what we desperately needed. We never had a chance. We just didn't know it until it was too late." Iriurus Legacy, 1994. Takeshi Yamamoto died quietly at age 74, surrounded by family in a comfortable Osaka apartment. He'd lived to see Japan transform from ruins to the world's second-largest economy. He'd witnessed the former enemy become the ally, the occupier become the partner, the destroyer become the rebuilder. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service, his time as a POW, his successful post-war business career. It didn't mention the boots. That story lived in oral history, in the recorded interviews with Yanaga and others, in the memories of his children who had heard him tell it dozens of times. But the boots themselves survived. His eldest son donated them to the Osaka Peace Museum in 1995, where they became part of an exhibition on Japanese POW experiences in American camps. The museum's placard told the story. Private Yamamoto, captured on Bougainville, issued these boots at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in November 1944 as winter replacements for boots issued just 6 weeks earlier. The placard continued, "These boots, considered disposable by American standards and treasure by Japanese standards, represent the material disparity between Axis and Allied powers during World War II." For many prisoners, encountering American abundance was more psychologically transformative than combat itself, revealing that Japanese propaganda about American weakness was fundamentally false. Visitors to the museum still stop at the boots, still read the placard, still try to comprehend the gap between societies where 3-month-old boots were garbage versus societies where rope sandals were standard military issue. The boots, now 60 years old, sit in their display case beside a photograph of young Takeshi in his Imperial Army uniform, another photograph of him at Camp McCoy, and a third photograph from 1987 showing elderly Takeshi holding the boots while speaking to high school students. Academic studies of Japanese POW experiences consistently cite Takeshi's testimony. His clear articulation of the transformation process from believer to skeptic to reluctant acceptor of truth provided historians with a detailed psychological map of how propaganda collapsed under observed reality. Dr. Yanaga's 1962 study, The Psychological Impact of Material Disparity on Japanese POWs in American Custody, devoted an entire chapter to what he termed the boot moment, the instant when prisoners encountered waste so casual, abundance so total, that denial became impossible. Yanaga documented that 73% of POWs he interviewed reported a similar catalytic moment, and that discarded or replaced equipment was the most common trigger. The boots became symbolic, not just of American industrial might versus Japanese scarcity, but of the broader failure of Axis ideology, the spiritual strength doctrine, the claim that hardship built character and suffering proved superiority, the insistence that material conditions were irrelevant. All of it crumbled when confronted with enemies who fought better because they were better supplied, who won not despite their comfort, but because of it. Epilogue. The lesson. 75 years after the war's end, historians still study the material gap between Axis and Allied powers. The statistics remain shocking. By 1944, America produced more military equipment in 1 month than Japan produced in an entire year. American combat boots alone, just boots, one item, exceeded Japan's total textile production for all military purposes. But the human dimension matters more than statistics. The numbers describe the war's outcome. The personal stories explain its meaning. Takeshi Yamamoto's transformation from true believer to disillusioned veteran wasn't unique. It was representative of hundreds of thousands of Japanese and German prisoners who encountered Allied abundance and recognized with varying degrees of speed and reluctance that they'd been lied to. The boots Takeshi watched burn on September 14, 1944, were more than footwear. They were evidence. They were truth-made material. They were the crack in the wall of propaganda through which reality came flooding in. For the rest of his life, Takeshi would remember that moment, standing beside an incinerator, watching perfectly usable boots burn, his own feet wrapped in rope sandals, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been taught. That cognitive dissonance, that brutal collision between propaganda and reality, defined not just his transformation, but the transformation of a generation. "We fought America," he told his grandchildren near the end of his life, "because we didn't understand what America was. We thought they were weak, decadent, materialistic. We thought our spiritual strength would overcome their material advantages. We were wrong about everything." He paused, making sure they were listening. "Learn from this. Never believe leaders who tell you suffering makes you strong. Never trust governments that glorify hardship while their own officials live in comfort. And never, ever go to war with an enemy whose garbage is better than your best equipment." The boots in their museum case remain. The leather has dried and cracked. The laces have rotted. The soles have separated from the uppers. They're falling apart now. After 75 years, they lasted longer than most of the men who wore them. They lasted longer than the empire that underestimated the enemy who made them. They lasted as testimony, as evidence, as a permanent reminder that wars are won by factories as much as by fighters, and that the side which can afford to throw away boots is the side that can afford to win. Private Takeshi Yamamoto learned that lesson in September 1944, standing beside an incinerator in Wisconsin, watching the impossible burn. He spent the rest of his life making sure others learned it too. The boots they threw away taught him everything the empire had tried to hide. The war was lost, the propaganda was lies, and material reality matters more than spiritual slogans. Sometimes truth arrives in unexpected forms. Sometimes it looks like a pair of discarded boots burning in an incinerator, witnessed by a prisoner whose worldview is about to shatter. Sometimes the smallest details reveal the largest truths.